Welcome back everybody to the Cowboy Slot Channel, where I bring you experienced advice from years of working in the casinos, tips, reviews, and so much more. This is episode number 5 of our continuing free series here on this channel to help you guys better identify and also better understand those great paying slot machines. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, go back. We've got an entire playlist just for this series. Go back and review those episodes, because by the end of this series, once you've watched all the episodes from start to finish, you'll be able to better understand and better identify those great paying slot machines. Since this is a series, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell to stay notified for when the next episodes come out. In today's episode, episode number 5, we're going to be talking about some different variables that you should consider when you're looking at slot machines and looking at those pay tables. So we're going to be taking all of the information from the previous episode, episode number 4, and we're going to be diving deeper into it. So if you haven't seen that previous episode, be sure to go watch that, because these two episodes go hand in hand together. So let's talk about multipliers. Now, it's very common on slot machines to have multipliers that are either a double or a triple, but anything beyond that can really affect the game. So what do you do, and how good are those games that have 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 10 times, 12 times, even 100 times pay? What do you do in those cases, and how do those machines act? Because as we discussed on the last video, you're looking for a small pay table. However, there are some games that do have a small pay table, but they have really high multipliers. So should you be avoiding those games, and why? Some machines will have a small pay table, but they have really high multipliers. So what does that mean, and is that a bad thing? Well, the answer is yes, it is. The higher multipliers that a machine has, or the more multipliers a machine has, the more volatile that game is going to be. What this means is machines with higher multipliers, or multiple multipliers, are going to have a less chance of actually hitting. This is where we can also talk about risk versus reward. So yes, those higher multiplier games can hit some really great, amazing payouts. However, it is very unlikely for them to hit that. Games like 5 times pay, 10 times pay, or 12 times pay, or anything higher than that, it's not going to hit as frequently. Yes, it is going to have a bigger reward if it hits. However, you're going to go through more of your bankroll, and it's going to be much harder to hit on those machines. So when you are looking at the pay table, you want to also take into account if the game has multiple multipliers or really high multipliers. If it does, steer clear from it. It's not going to hit as often. Could it hit? Absolutely. Could it hit big? Absolutely. But the chances of that happening are a lot less. So again, take that into consideration when you're considering the volatility of a game. There's also another identifying factor that you can use that's more commonly found with games like 10 times pay, 12 times pay, or even, and these are very hard to find, but there are still some out there, 100 times pay machines. You can actually look at the reels themselves, and you'll notice that on those games with really high multipliers, those reels are going to have bigger gaps in between. They're going to have a lot more blank spaces. So that's kind of another way that you can also tell when you are looking at these slot machines. The biggest takeaway from this episode is, if you've located a machine that fits all of the criteria from the previous episode and has a small pay table, double check and look to see what kind of multipliers the game has. If the game has anything higher than a double or a triple multiplier, then steer clear from it, because chances are it's not going to hit as frequently or as often. So let's talk about progressive games. Progressive games are something that has grown in popularity tremendously, and most casinos now, almost every single game that you see has a progressive attached to it. And even some older style slot machines have progressives attached to it. It's important to understand that there are different types of progressives, and they're very easy to identify in many cases. There's a wide area progressive, which is going to be like your Wheel of Fortune games, your Mega Bucks, and those games the progressive is linked and shared with multiple machines all across the country, or that casino's network. Then you've got local progressives. The local progressives are commonly found with games like Dancing Drums, Lightning Link, 88 Fortunes, all of those new style games that everybody loves to play, and those progressive amounts are typically shared with a bank of machines or within that casino's network. Now, with progressives that are linked to each other, it's important to understand that even though the progressive amounts might be linked and shared with other machines, the games in a Class 3 facility are still standalone, meaning they're going to play independently from each other. And then finally, there's also the standalone progressive. The standalone progressives can easily be identified, especially if they're in an area with other progressive games. You'll notice this because the amounts are different from the other games around it. So say for example, if you have 3 machines and they all have progressives and they're all the same game, but the amounts are different on each progressive, that's a clear indication that that progressive is a standalone unit, which means it's not shared with the other games in that bank. So how do the progressives actually have an effect on the volatility of a game? Well, technically, they really don't. However, most large progressives, especially the bigger amounts you go, are attached to higher volatile games. We can clearly see that with games like Dancing Drums or Dragon Link or Lightning Link. Those games are extremely high in volatility, meaning that those progressives are harder to obtain. Can you win great amounts from a progressive game? Yes, absolutely. It happens every single day. But it's not necessarily always the best game to play. If you are going to play a progressive game, look for a standalone unit and look for a progressive that is attached to a low volatile game. There are several casinos out there that have progressive amounts that are tied to low volatile games like Double Diamond. So if you are wanting to play those progressive games, look for standalone units that are attached to lower volatile games. And again, those progressive games are going to fall into that category of higher risk and higher reward. You're going to spend a lot more money to get that progressive. My biggest advice for progressive-based games is if you are wanting to play a progressive, then make sure that you A, don't chase that progressive, and B, make sure that you're looking around at all of the other machines. You want to determine what type of progressive it is first before you get started. Is it a wide area? Is it a local progressive? Or is it a standalone unit? Remember too that oftentimes, not always, but most of the time, progressive games are attached to a higher volatile game. And remember, as we've covered in previous topics, you want to try to avoid higher volatile games. So let's talk about pay lines. There's a lot of these newer style games, and I'm going to use Dancing Drums as an example for this one, that actually don't have any lines at all. Dancing Drums on that game, as long as the cymbals fall on the first 3 reels or more, you get paid for it. It sounds great, doesn't it? Well, here's the bad part. A lot of these new style games like Dancing Drums out there that don't have any lines at all, or some of these games that have really, really long reels and crazy amounts of cymbals, as we've discovered in the previous episodes, the more a machine has, the higher the volatility of it is going to be. And these games are no different. If a game has no lines, or if the game has several hundred lines, as many of these newer style games do, or if the game has a lot of different symbols involved with it, the game is going to be higher in volatility. Why is that? Because again, as we've covered in previous episodes, the RNG has way more options to pick from. You want to have that goal in mind to stick to a simpler game. A lot of these newer games are really, really fun and promise these huge amounts, especially on progressives. However, because of their high volatility, it is much harder to hit on those games. So you want to take those factors into account when you're looking at slot machines and pay special attention, especially to these newer style games. When it comes to older style games with multiple lines, there are many older games out there that have either 3, 5, or 9 pay lines. When you're comparing an older machine with multiple lines to a newer machine with multiple lines, the older machine is still going to be a little bit lower in volatility. For example, if you're going to compare an older machine with 5 lines to a brand new slot machine with hundreds of lines, that 5-line machine is still going to be way less volatile than the new machine, but it is going to be slightly more volatile than a machine with, say, 1 or 3 pay lines. But the good news is that small difference in volatility between a single line older machine and a 5-line older machine really is not that much. So if you're wanting to play multiple lines, go ahead and play those 3 or 5-line machines because the volatility on those is still going to be way lower than a brand new machine with no pay line or 100 pay lines. This episode and the previous episode, episode number 4, go hand in hand together. This is all information that you want to take into account when you're looking at a pay table on a slot machine. Remember, higher multipliers, harder to hit on. A lot of different lines, a lot of different symbols. Basically, any machine that has a lot going on is going to be higher in volatility and thus much harder and difficult to hit on. And you also want to take into account if the game has a progressive. What type of progressive is it? What type of game is it attached to? Double check all of that information before you sit down and play these games. The biggest common mistake that people make is walking into a casino and playing these games and not looking at the pay tables or understanding that all of these take into account and factor into how the machine is going to play and how it's going to pay out for you. So let's talk about another type of game that's out there. And these games really are not as common, but you especially see some in Las Vegas or other really big gaming cities. I'm talking, of course, about your all or nothing style slot machines. Now, these games used to be really popular back in the day, and they kind of faded out for a little bit, but they are gradually coming back. There's a slot machine out there called Cash Machine. I'm sure you've seen it, where the number that falls in the window is the number that you get. In older style games that are not as common anymore, but do still float around out there, they're usually called something like 100 or nothing or 500 or nothing style games. So those style games have an extremely simple pay table. It's either what you see is what you get, like on Cash Machine, or all or nothing, right? Well, unfortunately, those games are relatively higher in volatility. So even though they have a very simple pay table, a game like All or Nothing or Cash Machine is going to be a lot harder to hit on because those particular games can go a very long period of time without hitting anything. My advice: steer clear of them. So I know this seems like a lot of information, but you will get better at it with time. This is a lesson series, so if you missed the first several episodes of this series, go back and check out the playlist. And there's going to be more episodes after this, so be sure to hit that bell and stay notified for when the next episodes come out. By the time this lesson series is complete, you'll be able to have all of these factors in your mind to go to the casino and find a slot machine, and you'll know exactly what you're looking at whenever you sit down to play. So let's do a quick recap. Avoid machines with high multipliers. Avoid machines with a lot of multipliers. Be really observant of progressive games. Some can be good, some can be bad, and most of the time they're attached to higher volatile games. So you want to take that into consideration. Look around the casino. Check out all the different progressives. You might find a progressive on a game that's going to be easier to hit on. So make sure that you're following that step 1 in episode 1 and walking around your entire casino to check out all the games. If you take the lesson in this episode and apply it with the lesson in the previous episode, episode number 4, you're going to gain a huge advantage when you walk into a casino over other players that are not knowledgeable on how these games work or what to watch for before you put your money in the machine. Thank you guys so much again for tuning into the Cowboy Slot channel. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and again, hit that bell to stay notified for when the next episode in this series comes out. As always, best of luck to you, stay safe, and I'll see you next episode.